Chapter 1. Amber flicked a small flame in and out of existence above her finger, trying to hide the fact that she was staring at the new kid in the small classroom. He'd been here over a week now, and he still hadn't said more than a few words. All he did was answer the questions her father asked. Apparently, he'd all but graduated into a full mage beforehand, but she didn't get any information as to why he was in this class then. For the past few days, she had busied herself by trying to guess what his specialty was going to be. The next flame she flicked into existence suddenly flared upwards in a powerful burst. She saw Jonathan quickly rise back into consciousness, giving her a pointed look before going back into teaching mode.
Amber, can you define a cataclysm for me?
Amber scowled. If he was going to ask the question, he didn't need to make her magic flare up like that. The question was an easy one to answer, but it was his go-to for stressing the importance of any magic lesson. This was the 4th time today. It was starting to get more boring than the subject itself. A cataclysm is a magical reduction event that occurs when magic gets out of hand. The event could be a small intervention by a host, the death of every living mage, or the rewriting of magic as we know it.
I see you've streamlined the definition even further. If it weren't because of your lack of focus, I'd be proud of that. Pay attention, Amber. I know you don't like the astral class, but you'll need to know their techniques. Now, can anyone identify the astral technique I just used on Amber?
Amber rolled her eyes and then stared off into the distance. Her father put too much emphasis on astrals. All of their spells focused on support. They could hardly do anything on their own. Not to mention you had to knock yourself out to use most of their techniques. Amber's mom had supposedly been able to cast those spells without astral projecting, and Jonathan was very fond of reminding Amber of that fact. She'd heard the story 1,000,000 times at this point. How her mother sacrificed herself to save his life. Except that wasn't the way Amber saw it. Her mom had basically died for no good reason, and Jonathan had more or less handled the creature on his own. It wasn't that she didn't respect her mother, but Amber didn't want to be some tragic story, and she didn't want to be support for someone more talented. Still, her father would teach her about astral spells until he was blue in the face. Nicholas and Connor were both paying close attention to the lecture. They hadn't had to endure those lessons for as long as her. Connor seemed especially concentrated, but he did that for every lesson. He was determined, but not the brightest when it came to magic. Nicholas, on the other hand, already seemed to know the answer to every question. If she had to guess, he was only focused because he was inspired by Jonathan. Honestly, who wouldn't be? Her father had personally revolutionized the art of pyromancy, to the point that mages around the world were looking into all forms of elemental magics as a more viable art. That's why she'd chosen to specialize in fire magic after all. Now, if only he could stop talking long enough to let everyone announce their chosen specialties. In the meantime, she could occupy herself with the other task she'd been working on for the past few weeks, trying to guess what Nicholas's specialty was going to be. He could remember facts pretty well, though that's the only real thing he displayed on a daily basis. Maybe he'd do well as a wizard, creating reproducible magical items from monster essences. Unique items could be powerful, but the reproducible items were one of the major ways that mages contributed to the world. Maybe he was going to be a regular mage, though. It was the standard, and he seemed like a pretty standard guy. Chances were that he wouldn't have the personality to use one of the elements. He'd probably go for something like a substance. Substance magic failed for the same reason that Earth wasn't included in the table of magical elements. It was just inefficient. Not that any magic was perfectly efficient, but that held especially true for any form of substance magic. It was hard to measure efficiency with magic, but the highest upper estimate she'd heard of was around 80% if you'd specialized in a substance for decades. Most likely, if you took on a substance, that power would be less than half your physical capabilities for years. Straightforward magic and straightforward disadvantages. Yeah, that all seemed to align with Nick. Even though he probably knew about the inefficiency, she just couldn't see him using something incorporeal like fire, or any of the elements for that matter.
Amber, could you please define a cataclysm for me?
Twice in a row now? Her father gave her a stern look.
If you aren't going to pay attention, I can at least be sure you'll learn that lesson.
He tapped his finger expectantly, eyes locked with hers until she started repeating herself. A cataclysm is a magical reduction event that occurs when magic gets out of hand. The event could be a small intervention by a host, the death of every living mage, or the rewriting of magic as we know it.
Good. If you're bored with answering that question, then perhaps you'd prefer to pay attention to the new material?
Amber kept her thoughts to herself and stayed silent. The truth was that none of this was really new material to her. She'd had to learn all about astral techniques very early on. In fact, they were some of the first things she'd been allowed to practice since none of their spells caused direct harm.
Now, I know you've all been waiting for this. It's time to announce your specialties before we start training you in them. Connor, why don't you go first?
So, he was going to go by seed order. She'd have to wait a little longer to see if she guessed right about Nick. Connor stood up shakily to her left, clearing his throat and taking a deep breath before working up some nerve.
Sir, I've chosen to be a mystic as my specialty.
Jonathan nodded, and Amber rolled her eyes. Of course, he knew all about that. Amber had mentioned it to him on multiple occasions. It was a topic that came up quite a bit between her and Connor, so naturally she'd tell her dad at some point. Jonathan pointed the eraser end of his pencil towards her, like he needed to hear her choice. She'd bugged him 1,000,000 times to learn some of his fire techniques already, and she was pretty sure she'd declared that she'd become a pyromancer on multiple occasions. She didn't bother standing up like Connor. You know my specialty. I'm going to be a fire mage.
It's a formality. Besides, it's never too late to change your mind.
Amber grumbled. Her father had tried to convince her not to follow in his footsteps before, but she hadn't expected him to say anything today. This was supposed to be special. Whatever. She could still figure out what was up with Nicholas. He finally stood up, still as unenthusiastic as ever. Jonathan finally turned his attention to the boy.
Right. Nicholas, you seem eager. Would you mind stating your intended specialty?
I'm going to minor as a rune master, and major as a substance mage. Nailed it. She might have missed the rune master bit. At least he was doing something technical on the side. Now she just had to find out what kind of substance he planned to specialize in. There would be only one, especially since he was planning to minor in something as complex as rune magic. What would it be? Stone? Metal? Those could be useful in terms of detection, but attacking spells were usually one-shot wonders with substances as rigid and heavy as those. That would explain the minor in runes. Nicholas began to sit back down.
Wait a sec there, Nick. I'll need you to declare your substance. It's required by the state. You'd have to be just as specific in becoming an elemental mage.
Oh, good. She'd yet to find that out before training. Now to see just how right she was. Nicholas stood back up fully. Here it was, the big choice. No matter what he picked, it wasn't going to change much. Steel and stone were the best choices, and those mages rarely ever went higher than the middle of the pack anyway.
I'm training in the substance of paper.